Well, happy St. Patrick's Day. We've got to get in the season here. So, got some Lucky Charms. And they're like, okay, anyway, anybody hear my talk last year? How the West was pwned. What did we talk about last year? Yeah, cyberwar. Well, what are we doing in terms of cybersecurity? What directions are we going? If we look over time, we find out that we're slowly working our way into a new age, which should probably be called the Pwn age, right? Because what we're noticing is that it's easier and easier for stuff to get pwned on the system. The concern I'm talking about now is not you as an individual or anybody else, but the West. Talking about the West, United States, Canada, Western Europe, most of the industrialized nations that we think of as being sort of part of our allies, we're seeing this giant sucking sound going to the east, with apologies to Ross Perot. And why are we concerned about that? Well, it's going to affect our economic well-being, our society, our stability, our critical infrastructures and things like that, and we really are constantly in a position to do something about it. So last year we talked about hacking as an act of war. And we looked at the activities of what was going on with folks like this who are getting paid to go ahead and hack en masse against the United States of America. We found out that some of the statistics suggest that there are as many as 160,000 PLA operatives working directly on cyber espionage against the United States and other nations. And going back to the ancient Chinese doctrines of Sun Tzu, remember that on page 1, line 1, first sentence, he says, all warfare is based on deception. So we expect that, we should anticipate that, because if we're reading their playbook, we can understand a little bit about what they're thinking too. Professor Leota said all warfare tends toward asymmetry. We know what that is, which is a small input creates a large output. And doesn't cyber really allow you to do that? Because it really evens the playing field. Instead of having to be an industrialized nation or having to have great capacity, you could take whatever you've got and get in the fray. And so if you're China, you can play. If you're Iran, you can play. Even North Korea has taken both of their computers and they're using them for cyber espionage, okay? So the point is, anybody can play now. But then I went back and did a little more research. I went back to Niccolò Machiavelli, if you remember him, who wrote The Prince. And there was a statement in there I thought was very relevant. And he said there's no avoiding war. It could only be postponed to the advantage of others. So last year I talked about hacking as an act of war, and yet we have not seen all-out cyber warfare. So the answer to the question of why we have not, I think, lies in this. But to whose advantage does it lie that we're not at war right now? Come on. No, it's not. To the Chinese, exactly. Lucky Charms, who are you? All right, right 2, down 1, fire for effect.
His golf game's bad.
Not really. That's a problem. Okay, so, of course we wonder, like, who, me? Who's doing all this stuff? And we like to think that we can pretty much attribute that, but attribution on the internet is one of the most difficult things to do, because you can do reflector attacks, you can bounce off of everybody else, and we're looking at trying to come up with some way to define who's causing the problem. Well, we look at China and we find out that they're pretty huge. 1.3 billion people, Carl Sagan would love that. As compared to the United States, about 313 million. Canada, about 1/10 of the US. The city of Chongqing in China has nearly the same population as the entire nation of Canada. It's an immense number of people packed into a small area. And of course, you look here at Raleigh, and then we're down another order of magnitude. And yet, if you look at the area of the nations, you always say, like, Russia is the largest, followed by Canada, then China and the United States. But if you count water area, it actually nudges the U.S. just a little bit up in the third place over China. Now, what's interesting is that if you study the geopolitics of what's happening right now, China is making claims to a number of outlying islands out there in the South China Sea and in the Western Pacific, saying, well, this is ours, and then we're going to draw a 200 nautical mile ring around it, and that's our territorial waters, so then we can get bigger than the United States. No, actually it's for mineral rights and for undersea exploration, but politically it's getting really interesting, because now they're going up against places like not only Japan and South Korea, but the Philippines and other nations in that area, basically claiming little rocks that are out there, some of them which go underwater at full tide. But yet they're building airstrips and things like that to extend the reach. Because if you look at Chinese military strategy, what they're looking at doing is building 3 defensive rings around China. The outside ring, the first row of islands is going to include things like, Taiwan. And the second row of rings will include things like, Guam. And the third row actually goes as far out to Hawaii. And so if you look at what they're doing, China's trying to become the regional hegemon. They want to say, we own the Western Pacific. It's our territory. The United States is an interloper. They've been here since 1945, and they're slowly going to try to push us out of that area. So in addition to military efforts, they're going to do it economically as well as industrially and a lot of other things. And so this is not just hacking for the sake of hacking. It's part of a big grand scheme which is designed to return China to what they believe is their rightful place in history. Because if you go back and look at 18 of the last 20 centuries, the largest economy in the world was what? Who said U.S.? Give me back those Lucky Charms. Fail. Okay, it's China, okay? And we find out that the Chinese believe their rightful place is as number one. Now, when did China close their borders? 1840s, back in the Opium Wars, when Great Britain and the Western were trying to trade with them, the Chinese said, we don't want to buy anything you got, we only want your hard currency, we want gold. And they were selling tea and spices, things like that. They finally said, hey, let's sell them opium, we'll get them all drug addicts. And finally, Chinese emperor said, we got to do something about this, and they shut down the borders. And the borders stayed shut down until when? No, not until the revolution, until 1972 when Richard Nixon came over there. Because even in the revolution, they were very much isolationist, okay? I don't know why I waste my time with these things. Anyway, at least I got lots of Lucky Charms. So if you take a look at the People's Republic of China, you're going to find out also that they're very closely approaching the largest English-speaking population on the planet, about 300 million people. Now, there's a little asterisk down there, like Roger Maris 61, and it says essentially that this also includes people who have introductory level knowledge of the English language. But for the most part, if you can read Unix commands and you can read some commands, you can do a lot of stuff and you can be functional in this area. Also, they look at their 5-year plan. They're now into 12 5-year plan. Okay, do the math, 60 years, run it back, there's your revolution. But one of their major 7 priorities is new information technology, broadband networks, internet security infrastructure. Wow, do we think we have a national major 5-year effort for information security infrastructure for the internet? We can't even decide who owns the thing. And network convergence. And their intellectual property work plan was really talking about strengthening intellectual property transformation and utilization. How do you transform and utilize intellectual property? First, you have to appropriate it. Exactly. And so what we're going to find out is that someone had mentioned, I couldn't find the reference, so I didn't put it in the talk, that there's a 50-year strategic plan for China, of which they're about 25 years into, because it started in 1988, which suggests that their goal is to own 98% of the intellectual property of planet Earth within 25 more years. And guess what? They are on track. So how's, yes, sir?
Sorry to interrupt, but talking about goals, did you read that thing this week where they were talking about China is making some kind of DNA database of people with higher intelligence? They were going to try and raise the national average of intelligence by 15 points.
Interesting. Well, some people would suggest that certain individuals, if they emigrated to China, would raise the intelligence of both nations. But no, I have not heard that. That's very, very interesting. So now you get into genetic shaping. Remember, China for years has been in the one-child policy, which now gives them a couple interesting factors. They've got a pretty robust work economy because there's a big imbalance of workers compared to old people, so not a whole lot of overhead. But there's also about almost in some places a 115 to 100 ratio of male to female, because when you can select your offspring, you pick a male because it's more useful for you as a family. And so now there's a lot of unsatisfied testosterone there. And usually the way most nations bleed off that pressure is war, attrition. So we'll see how this one goes. But that's a very interesting insight. So how's the U.S. organized to defend against this threat? Well, we have the Department of Defense, all right? And as a loyal member of the Department of Defense for years and years, we recognized that we had different elements that provided us with resources. We had defense contractors and, of course, the defense suppliers. Because without the contractors and the suppliers, well, we'd just be at the pointy end. And it turns out that ultimately what's the big principle behind the military in the United States is civilian control of the military. So, of course, we have the government of the United States of America. But wait, there's more. It's not just that, because what do we get for the contractors? Who else comes into the contractor houses but Chinese espionage agents? So they're bleeding stuff out the bottom. And when we buy all of our products and services, what happens? Well, we get counterfeit Chinese goods. Some of these things working their way into weapons platforms and the like. And ultimately, of course, somebody is stealing all this stuff, and so it's people's... Oh, I love the fact when you find out, like, the U.S. has, the Pentagon has T-shirts printed up that says "Stop China" and like "Made in China." It's like, come on. So how do you characterize this whole thing? I mean, it's basically a Pwn boy sandwich. I mean, they've got us on both ends. And so if that's the situation, well, we're kind of Pwn, and life's tough. So recognizing that we're not going to be able to go ahead and necessarily reply in kind, at least for a couple more years, at which point then kids grow up and they cause trouble, and they even the score, what do we do? Well, of course, we just have to turn to corporations, because the United States says, hey, let's go to Mandiant, because just in time for RSA, everybody's wondering about why the timing on this report. Mandiant had the report on APT1, and what it was essentially saying, we are doing the attribution. We are going to pin down not only the organization that's doing it, but the street address and the lat and the long and everything else like that, and the number of people and their resources and everything else. Very significant. Anybody read the Mandiant report yet? Okay, anybody like downloaded but hasn't gotten around to reading it? Okay, everybody else don't care, right? It's free. Go to Mandiant.com. You can take a look at it, and they have an intel report. But here's my question. Why isn't this thing being issued by the United States government, the White House, okay? So this was the Pwn boy sandwich, right? But the reality is we're finding out that that's not the real structure. This is the new world order, because we're finding out that these guys are trying to, and oh, by the way, I don't work for them. I have no financial interest in it, but I'm just looking at it as an outside third party. It's like, come on, people. If you're a government, be a government and speak up for yourself. Well, we're talking about APT, and this whole thing was about advanced persistent threat. And so if you kind of look at what is an APT, it's a cyber adversary with advanced capability. It's also a three-letter marketing dream for a lot of companies who can say, well, this APT and that APT. But in general, the idea is it's somebody who's sophisticated, they hang around a long, long time, and they do bad things. All right, some people would suggest that also equals a mother-in-law. But in this case, we're more concerned about cyber. If you take a look at the APT1 that was demonstrated or described in the Mandiant report, they talk about some pretty amazing track record of accomplishments and success. A huge amount of penetration and persistence, the average persistence being just under 1 year. One of them was over 4 years, 10 months, okay? I mean, that's an entire presidential administration and then some to be inside a network of a U.S. major defense department or U.S. government agency, and to stay there and persist and to collect and to collect and to collect. And I finally found a number that was bigger than the U.S. national debt. That's what it was as of this morning, $16 trillion. But about 1 petabyte of data is what we're looking at, just a huge, huge amount of it. And if you look more in the report, 87% of their targets are English-speaking, and 97% of the machines that are being used through the exfiltration are registered to China. So they're at the point where they say, like, we don't even care about this attribution thing, right? Because, why bother to pay extra money to GoDaddy when we have our own registrars? And besides, maybe they don't watch their ads that we have. Anyway, their attack infrastructure, huge amount out there, and it's being used to target against the United States. So they're going to name names, they're going to put locations. Bingo, here we go. PLA Unit 61398 in that particular building in Shanghai. Kind of reminds me of Experiment 626, right? Except I figured that we're going to recolor him a little bit for the purposes, and that became like a really cool logo. I guess I'll have to request fair use for this because it's not mine, it's copyright somebody's. I think Disney. But nonetheless, with a little bit of modification, it's a parody, and I think I can get away with it. You find out that these folks are formally organized to be within the People's Liberation Army. Now, the People's Liberation Army own all of their military stuff. If you're in the Chinese Navy, what are you in? The PLAN, the People's Liberation Army's Navy. Now, I always wonder, how do they do the Army-Navy games? But I know, because the Navy, like, what are we, 8-0 the last few years? But huge amount of people, huge amount of capabilities, and of course, offensive warfare. And so as this report comes out, we find out that, again, we're pretty much owned. That no matter what we do, that they're going to do whatever they want to us, and we don't seem to have pretty adequate defenses. So what's the United States saying and doing about this? Okay, they even name names, Ugly Gorilla and Super Hard and things like that, and no, this is not some sort of a porn shop. These are actually the handles that these people are picking to go ahead and use it. Interestingly enough, I read a point where Anonymous was going out and trying to identify and get some pictures of these guys from over in China. Anybody here from Anonymous? Hey, every now and then, you get the people who, and then we kind of export them, and again, we raise our intelligence while raising somebody else's. But for the most part, I thought that was a pretty cool thing to go out and try to identify these people. But here's a little quote, in the report, we expect reprisals from China. We expect an onslaught of criticism. Then why did you publish the thing? Because you got paid a boatload of money to do it, and money works. So what's the secret to PRC's Pwning success? Any ideas? Systems, a lot of people.
A lot of people just doing nothing else.
A lot of people doing nothing. Well, they go home at night. In fact, if you look at some of the patterns of the cyclical, they come into work in the morning, they go home at night. So there are a lot of it is like in the middle of our night, but it tends to be business hours their times. Other things that make them successful. Ideology, because they believe that what they're doing is patriotism for China, and they will also recruit Chinese ancestry people in the United States saying, hey, this is something that would be good to do. So we look at some of the things like the Economic Espionage Act and the cases that actually go to court. Many of them are against Chinese, if not Chinese citizens, U.S. citizens that were from Chinese ancestry. Also, if you got grandma back in the old country, they can kind of lean on you a little bit to go ahead and do that. Other thoughts?
There were no repercussions.
No repercussions, because the whole idea is, what are we going to do about it? Now, in the United States, we got all these legal systems and things like that. In China, they have their own legal systems. But what is the legal system of the world called? When nobody's in charge, what do you call that? Anarchy, exactly. And so the international order of things is anarchy, which is whatever you can get away with, you get away with. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at different forms of government. But I think the secret to their success is that you just can't find where they're at.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but wasn't there a policy by Mao called 1,000 grains of rice or birds or something like that? Or
1,000 bird droppings?
something like you're supposed to leave China, go learn something, and bring it back.
Yeah.
What was it called? Or
Something along like the 1,000 grains of rice. I think the first President Bush had the 1,000 points of light that was modeled shortly after that. It was a fiber optic version, but it didn't work too well. But anyway, because they're pwning us, I say that's not necessarily that, but we'll probably redo their model a little bit. And the secret to their pwnage is that, again, hard attribution. How are you going to prove how they're pwning you? Now, if we look at the government statements, the U.S. National Intelligence Estimate was just released last month on the 10th of February. And we figured, this is great. Let's take a look at it. They got a whole lot of money in terms of the intelligence agencies that are reviewing things so we can look at the report. However, it's classified. So we can't see what they got to say, at least not at this level. But presumably that they had something useful to say. So right after the 10th of February, what happens? Our Irish president, Barack Obama, I figured I had to throw that in for St. Patty's Day, in his state, all right, I know, eat. Drink, I got to eat the Lucky Charms here. But he stated, we know foreign countries and companies swipe our corporate secrets. And shortly thereafter, Mike Rogers, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, has pointed out that China is stealing our intellectual property at a rate that qualifies as an epidemic. I got it. But of course, what are we doing about it? We're just making statements. So pretty soon we'll get to enjoy our new economy as we find out that what happens when we have $1.4 billion or trillion dollars of U.S. debt owned by China. What if they start dumping all that on the open market? Our dollar could be destabilized the way that George Soros destabilized the pound. It would go the way of the Zimbabwe currency when you have lots and lots of zeros at the end. And even back in the Weimar Republic, 50 billion marks to $1. But we keep thinking because of the United States, our currency can't be destabilized. But it's that same hubris and chutzpah that may put us in danger. Also, China, Russia, the EU are working very, very hard to remove the U.S. dollar as sort of the de facto standard for international trade. The problem with that is what? There's no really other good alternative.
Bitcoin!
The renminbi doesn't exchange too well. Pardon?
Internet money.
Internet money. Bitcoin, yes. We need a lot more of them.
Yeah, 22.
So then we look at the statement from the National Security Advisor of the United States just on the 11th of March. Okay, not that, this is all coming up this week. You know how tough it is to get these people to all release these statements in time for my CarolinaCon conference that I had to write this abstract for a month and a half ago? That's serious bonus. But look at it. The cybersecurity is a growing challenge to our economic relationship. U.S. businesses are getting worried about it, and we need China to engage themselves in a constructive dialogue. Come on, what about like nuclear weapons? Well, we don't do that stuff anymore. I mean, we just go ahead to diplomacy. At the end of the day, it's easier to call the State Department than the Defense Department, okay? Because they're cheaper and they tend to get the job done with less mess. But reality check here. How many people are employed with the U.S. State Department? Total, all the employees, government. Give me an order, 16 or 60? 50,000, 50. Actually, it's closer to about 6. About the loadout of a fully equipped aircraft carrier when it goes out to sea with its air wing on it. I mean, seriously, that's what they got. And they're not used to working when people shoot at you. So that's why you call Defense Department to do nation building when it's not really a DoD role. And that's why we've seen these extended wars over in Iraq and Afghanistan doing missions that typically were not part of U.S. military mission. Now, the next day, Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, talking to the Senate, point out Russia and China. Yeah, let's not forget our old friends, Russia. Aggressive practitioner of economic espionage. Also up in the top 4, along with Russia and China, are whom? Israel and France. Sacre bleu. Yeah, the French have been very, very good. Although Brazil, India, they're coming up as well. The BRIC nations, we're looking at that. And so they're in. We're basically saying we're pwned. They got us. And now, 72 hours ago, President Obama calls President Xi Jinping to congratulate him on the election as president now of the People's Republic of China for the next 10 years. This is a big deal. And he says, oh, by the way, we need to talk about this cybersecurity thing. Yeah, not like, hey, do you want to go to Chinese restaurants or something like that? But let's talk about cybersecurity. So we're getting to the point where, we're bringing up all this bluster. But, what's the translation of these government statements? Like, stop messing with us. We're like, oh, come on, what are we going to do about it? We're getting owned, and the problem is that our infrastructure, our people, our strategies, our policies, our doctrine are not working effectively to give us a defense against that. Now compare that to a society like North Korea. I mean, it's really tough to get into either one of their computers, but even trying to get into their territory, getting into their society, understanding. I mean, even when they had their new, their new great leader who succeeded, which is whom? Kim Jong-un from Kim Jong-il. It's like the grandson, okay, it's still in the family, but the first reports I read, they weren't even sure how old the guy was. So they do an extraordinarily good job of maintaining control of their information, but look at the cost to their society. I read a report earlier this week saying fully a quarter to maybe half of their population are physically stunted in their growth because of chronic malnutrition. Yet they can go ahead and develop and field nuclear weapons and test them. They can go ahead and launch rockets. They can build a huge military, and that's a real concern because as we look at things such as who are the rational actors out there, and we always put our own blinders on. Okay, Russia, a rational actor. Okay, China, a rational actor. They don't want this mutually assured destruction. But we look at countries like Iran or maybe North Korea, and we say, hey, we don't get what they're doing, so we declare them to be irrational. The danger here, though, is that you can't necessarily ascribe your own decision-making strategies to your potential opponent. Back in 1990 in Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and everybody was in the press reports, you go back and read them, says, madman, and this guy's nuts and crazy and things like that. I was working with a company, and one of the guys from Saudi Arabia. And people always are talking about how this crazy guy was going on, and he just said something like, that's not crazy, it's just the law of the desert, and he walked back into his office. Well, I followed him to his office to say, hey, Stuart, explain this to me. Why is this the law of the desert? He said, well, the culture there in the Bedouin is that if your neighbor offends you, you are honor bound to draw your sword and try to strike him and kill him. Now, if he blocks the blow, okay, honor's been served. You go back to being neighbors. But you go ahead and you mess with somebody, you fully expect to get someone to go ahead and whack at you. So in this particular case, the perceived offense was Kuwait pumping all the water out of the water, or all the oil out of the oil table, and they were very, very predictable. The problem with intelligence services is we tend to look at the world through a prism of our own experience, and a lot of times it's people who do that as well. So if there was a visual portrayal of U.S. and Chinese relations, how would that be? Where are we right now? Something like this, where, it's just not working out too well for us. And of course, the official Chinese response to all that is what? We didn't do it. Nobody can prove it. You didn't. Nobody saw me. You can't prove anything. So it sounds an awful lot like this guy. Okay. I don't know. Is there any reason Bart Simpson is yellow? Maybe we now know. But sorry, that's an old stereotype from many years ago. But the point is that their official statements say we didn't do it. You can't prove it. And even if you get caught red-handed, deny everything, okay? It really works well in politics. Why not try it at the national level? So what's the score? How are we doing? What do you say it was? 10 to 1. 10 to 0, yeah, it's worse than 10 to 0. We're like playing against Ken Jennings, and you know, he is like completely taking everything we have, and we're in the hole, and it's just kind of a runaway. So we've got to stop this stuff, because the problem is, if you think about it economically, what happens? If you develop a product or a drug or some technology, you spend years and a lot of money and time and effort in developing that intellectual property, and then you have to recapture that over time by being able to pay for that upfront investment. So you look at some of these drugs that people go ahead and buy, it's like, well, why does it cost so much to develop them? Well, it might take like $1 billion through all the clinical trials and things, and then you file for a patent, and then the patent is good for how long? 20 years from the date of filing, not the day you get it. So by the time you finish all the FDA tests and things like that, it might be 14 years into your 20-year cycle. You got 6 years to harvest your money back from that. And so as a result, what we have to look at is that if somebody could then, at year 20, 0 months, 0 days, what drugs then hit the market? Generic drugs. Why are they cheaper? Because they didn't have to pay the upfront cost. Now I've got to tell you, if I were a general in the People's Liberation Army or an admiral in the PLAN, I would be doing exactly the same thing that they're doing now. It is not irrational, it is not madmen, it is basically good international business in an anarchic world, and they're getting away with it. However, being an American, I say, hey, wait a minute, we're kind of on the losing end of the score. We'd like to, if not go ahead and take away some of his points, at least defend our points. So we need to be able to think about self-defense. Now, we could always call NATO. There is in NATO in Article 5 for self-defense. It says if any nation in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is attacked, all the others agree that they will respond as well. And NATO was formed back in 1949 against what threat? Not Russia, the Soviet Union. Somebody had an SSSR shirt, you know, CCCP, but I guess it got dirty and they changed it. Okay, they're not here. But the idea with the Soviet Union was, remember, they kind of grew and they got bigger and bigger, and of course it was the domino theory that we were worried about in Vietnam. You know, one country falls, they all fall. And so the Russian tanks coming through the Fulda Gap through East Germany was the biggest concern that we had. Well, the only time that ever was invoked was September 12th, 2001. So when people say how many nations are involved in the coalition in Afghanistan, one point is up to how many? Not 3 or 4 or 5. 39. It's come down a little bit, but all the members of NATO were there because that's just part of the deal. And then other nations such as South Korea and Australia and some of the nations in Eastern Europe wanted to go ahead and send folks over as well. Why? Because now if you're in Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, nations like that, who's your next door neighbor? Russia. Who would you love to have all of your friends come and rescue you if you ended up being invaded? Well, NATO. The problem is if you're Western Europe, you really want to go ahead and die for something in Ossetia or South Abkhazia provinces in Georgia, because when were those invaded by the Russians? August of 2008. What was happening in August of 2008? Da, 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 da. You know, everybody's looking at China with the Olympics, and the Russians come in there and invade one of their neighbors. It's like nobody says anything. And by the way, that attack on Georgia was accompanied by massive cyber attacks that pretty much blinded all the command and control and the infrastructure of that government. Because a couple years earlier, we found out that up in Estonia, when they moved the statue of the Russian liberator out of the downtown area, and of course, the Estonians didn't really feel all that liberated from 1945 through 1989. There was a big counterclash and attack against the government. But in each case, what was the international response? Not much. Okay? Yes, sir.
Wasn't the attack not based off Russia's own military cyber intelligence, but off Russian business network acting on behalf of Russia?
Yeah.
How would that play into said treaty? Because it's not technically. Repeat the question.
I always repeat the question. Yeah, what he's pointing about is that some of these attacks were not attributable to Russian military units, but it went through something called RBN, or the Russian Business Network. And so what happens when you got a civilian agency or a civilian entity that's acting as a proxy for the government? And if you look at why does the RBN survive and do well, I've heard reports that there's somebody there at the head of it who has a very close family relationship with the guy by the name of Putin. you know, the president who was previously the prime minister, who was previously the president, who's really a tsar by any other name. And the idea is that if you pay enough tribute to the government, they let you exist and thrive and do what you want. But where the lines are getting blurred when it comes to that asymmetry here is it's almost like mercenaries. And so if you have mercenaries working for you, which goes back all the way back to Roman Empire, some people suggest that's why Rome had a problem, because they wouldn't fight their own wars. They just hire people to go ahead and fight the invaders and things like that. And eventually, a mercenary, what happens if things get too bad? You're just working for a paycheck. You bug out. But if your families are at threat, your lifestyle is at threat, your nation's at threat, you hang in there and you make something work. And so the concern here is in cyber is would that mutual defect actually kick in when we go from cyber to kinetic? So again, your question is a good one, but the hard part is we have not got to the point where that's worked its way either into the international relations or the court level or in combat. Article 51 of the United Nations also has self-defense criteria in there. In fact, that's how we end up in Korea. You know, one of the things I asked last year was a little trivia question, the last time the U.S. declared war formally on anybody. And it was Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria in 1942. Yes, you know that, because you solved the crypto puzzle. Yeah, it's also a Ken Jennings thing. But I gave that, the talk I gave at CarolinaCon last year, I worked it, improved it, and I got accepted to talk over in Ireland last October. So that was pretty cool. So I got to go to Ireland. And I said, well, you know, I got to change it to Irish. So I got to change the O to OU and the Z's to S's, you know, some of the little language nuances. But then I said, well, this U.S. going to war slide doesn't make sense. So who should I look at? I know what we'll do. When was the last time Ireland declared war? I don't know. I had to do the research. Well, it turns out it was against Great Britain in 1922. And since half the audience was from the UK, half was from Ireland, I didn't really want to start a barroom brawl. So I left it out of the presentation. But as we find out that it's one way to go ahead and do that. But the problem with challenging big nations is, of course, they usually can bring a lot more hardware than you can. In the kinetic world, asymmetry is not a really good idea. Okay, in the cyber world, asymmetry works pretty well. And so what came out of this attack up in Estonia was the formation of the NATO Cybersecurity Center for Excellence. And the Cooperative Cybersecurity Center for Excellence had put together a team about 3 years ago to say, how do we look at the rules and laws of warfare? Yes, there actually are them. And then map those into cyberspace. And they had developed about a 215-page draft. It's supposed to be published this month. And you can go to this particular URL, ccdoe.org/249.html. And if we look at that, their goal was to say, how can we, by consensus, man, that's tough, get the laws that apply to kinetic war and apply them to cyber war? Well, why the manual? Because there are no international treaties on cyber right now. And as a result, it's brand new territory. So their thought was, if we can come up with a kind of a ground truth of what could work, maybe that's a start point for how we build cyber warfare rules and laws and treaties. So at the high level, it looks at, you know, what's right or justice in war and before war. And if it doesn't involve the equivalent as a use of force, it's not addressed. So if you go back and you look at something like the invasion, or not the invasion, but the cyber attacks that were on Estonia back in '06 when they moved that statue. Well, that was not any physical equivalent to that, so that doesn't count as cyber war. But let's look at something like, oh, I don't know, Stuxnet, which involved physical destruction of things. That would qualify as an act of cyber war because something actually breaks. So it's developed 95 rules of cyber warfare. I think when they nail that to the wall of the internet. And they said, well, it's not NATO doctrine, even though it was a NATO group, but yeah, it was an international consensus. So let's take a look at a couple of them. I'm not going to go through all 95, but Rule 9. If you're attacked, you can respond, which is reasonable, and you expect that's regular warfare, including cyber now. So now you can attack back. And Rule 11 defines it when it's actually a use of force, when it breaks something, when it kills people, when it damages something in the physical world. You can do self-defense, and you can do collective self-defense, and now you can figure out the law of armed conflict. So Georgia was a level of armed conflict. If you captured a Georgian soldier or if you captured a Russian soldier, but they were in uniform and they were fighting, the rules are a little bit different than if someone were a criminal. So if your grandfather fought over in World War II in Germany and now in his 80s wants to go over and visit Germany, they can't arrest him and say, well, your great-grandfather killed my great-grandfather on a battlefield at the Battle of the Bulge, therefore, you know, he's a killer. There are certain rules that if you abide by them in warfare, that when you go to peace, you're okay. Now, if you were Jack the Ripper and you wanted to go over and become like Johann the Ripper and you went around killing people over in Germany, that's a different story entirely. Interesting that commanders can still be held accountable for war crimes. How do we do that in a cyber war crime? You know, what do? They take away your BlackBerry? This is kind of interesting because it looks at combatant status and what makes you a lawful combatant. And a lawful combatant is somebody who is usually uniformed in a declared war or an undeclared war, but pretty identifiable. But volunteers or people who kind of like citizens who shoot out the window at a passing troop, you don't get any defense. They can come back and tear down your house and blow you up and things like that. But what's interesting is that if you look at international laws that pertains to kinetic warfare, if there is not a commander in charge, if there is no responsible leader, then none of the participants are entitled to protection under the laws of armed combat. And so I don't know whether they've thought about that in forming an organization such as Anonymous, but by definition not having somebody in charge suggests that none of the participants are going to be afforded any protections under the law. And cyber terrorism is prohibited. Not quite sure how we get to that point, but again, you're not supposed to be terrorist acts, so stuff like 9/11 was definitely not an approved activity from the laws of warfare. In the cyber world, you look for the equivalents. And what can you blow up? Well, if it's got both a civilian and military objective, you can do it. So an airstrip that's using for civilian and military aircraft, you can go after it. You can drop a bomb in the middle of that, but you're not going to drop a bomb in the middle of an orphanage or a grammar school, because that doesn't have it. And what if it's on a military base? No, it's not a military purpose. You don't do that. But you can use ruses of war like honeypots. That's cool. Interesting, cyber booby traps are prohibited. So what does that say about Trojan horses? Don't click here. If you have any kids that are under the age of 15, they can't become cyber combatants because, like COPPA, you know, they got all these rules to protect kids on the internet from evil. But interesting that they would actually try to translate that. Again, they're not trying to editorialize, they're saying, what are the rules of combat? You can't send kids to war, and they should not be able to do that. Diplomatic communication is protected. Neutral state can't allow belligerent attack. By the way, when Georgia was under attack in 2008, the president of the nation of Georgia had met an American businessman from Atlanta, Georgia, who ran an internet hosting company. And when he saw that everything was going south, they got in touch with each other, and they said, hey, can you host my stuff? And yeah. So the electronic seat of government for the nation of Georgia relocated to Atlanta for a while. And then they came under cyber attack, as you might expect, because all the IP addresses went over at the DNS. Does that now make the United States a participant in the conflict? Interesting idea. Was mercenaries. Well, yeah, and I don't even know if they paid the bill, but because it might have just been as a courtesy. But what's happening? As we go to handheld devices, we go to cloud computing, as the perimeter of our network is completely dissolves, the ability to protect our intellectual property and resources is pretty much going down to zero. We expect information free for anywhere, and because everything is getting globalized, we're going to a global economy. You can no longer be a fortress. You know, some of the last remaining economic fortresses or political fortresses like North Korea, we say you're pretty much just dysfunctional in a global society. It doesn't work right. But there's some game changers out there that can happen. And so stuff might happen that causes us to have a whole new cyber world. And of course, what happens is we get hit by one of these things, and it really surprises us. And we didn't expect that attack, but it does sort of change our outlook on things. So Dr. Tom Adams had talked about warfare leaving human space. He's saying that things are happening so fast that you can't put a human in the loop anymore. Because by the time you take a look at it, analyze it, think about it, or whatever, all the packets have arrived, they've done what they're going to do. And so it's not like the old days where you could go ahead and convene your cabinet or war council, you sit about things, you had this big thing where you slide stuff around with little sticks and the like. This war is going to be over in milliseconds, potentially. And so at that particular point, as we go from cyber espionage, which is not warfare, and oh, by the way, why are we not at war? The advantage is because they're collecting so much good stuff. If you go back and look at the history books, what happens like the Romans came and if they took you over, what did they demand from you? Tribute. And tribute basically said if you pay them a fee for them to occupy you, you live. Otherwise, they tear a lot of stuff down, they kill a lot of people, and make things rough. So you go back and you look in like biblical times 2,000 years ago, Romans were in there, and it kind of made life rough for you if you're living in the Middle East. But if you happen to be in a nation or a place where you paid the tribute and you paid them off, they were good. And he's also suggesting that we're just going to have to pretend to be in control because we can't do it. By the way, his comments, 2001. All right, so yeah, 12 years ago, this stuff was already foreseen. So what do we conclude? Pwned, we're going to take in the shorts. We're going to take it hard. We're going to take it off until finally we go ahead and come up with a better way to do business. But more importantly, I think we want to think about what can we do as individuals as part of this. We have a mission. We have an idea that says, hey, we're security folks, whether we're educational or whether we're professional in it, but can we contribute to not only the body of knowledge, but in the enforcement of it, but maybe influencing the political process. Because here in the United States, you do have access to Congress. Who writes laws in Congress? Not congressmen, it's the staffers, okay? So it's the, and you wonder how do you come up with like a 3,000-page healthcare law in 30 days? It's because people write big chunks of it. You can have some influence on that. You can cause some a little bit better behavior. And we can kind of limit the damage. Otherwise, we're going to find out that we as the Western nations and the collective are going to see our intellectual property slowly get siphoned over to the East, and it kind of serves us right because we're not doing anything about it. So those are my initial thoughts on that.
But don't you think that this whole, there's nothing new in this? China's been doing this for the last 10, 15 years.
Yes.
There's nothing new in this. So now we basically see the government reacting because something came out in the press. And so basically now suddenly we're now speaking to China. But I mean, if you heard that conference in the RSA, where the speakers were presenting there, they were saying that those things, there's nothing new. This is purely the politicians now saying the right thing and saying, hey guys, stop hacking us. But they've known about it for years. So
They have known about it for years. We've known about it for years.
State Department is really pissed off with them for them releasing this thing. Not because they didn't know about it, they knew all about it, they just wanted to keep the status quo. They knew about it, they just wanted to keep it to themselves. So there's nothing new with this hack thing.
Yeah, I agree. There's nothing new in that report, but there's some arguments that say, hey, they released it in time for RSA, so they can go ahead and trumpet them up. There's also some suggestions that said it was well coordinated with the U.S. government to say, well, the State Department can't release this stuff directly because it's too provocative, so let a neutral third party, i.e. a corporation, release it, and now we can start to doing the talking points that we think that we want to get out the door.
If we were attacking China at the same level, would they comment on it?
If we were attacking China at the same level, would they comment on it? I don't know. I can't speak for the Chinese.
So we don't know where parity is in the current status.
And so parity is tough to get to. Yes, sir. They just complained that we are doing them. Yeah, and if you take a look at some of the statement by General Keith Alexander, who's now going into his 8th year as the director of NSA and his 3rd year as commander of U.S. Cyber Command. He was talking this past week in the National Intelligence Director's comments once a year, saying, yeah, we're developing a lot of offensive capability. Now, the whole idea of offensive cyber weapons has been, don't talk about it, okay? It's been the kind of the elephant in the closet. Yes, sir.
My point is actually that the United States like sleep on a bed, China like sleep on a roof. Sleep on a bed can try to attack all the guy from sleep on a roof, all the guy from bed. But what it can do on a bed is somebody on a bed.
So what can you do with the...
My point is that if like America is much richer than China, well, Chinese, they want to get richer than the United States. They want to get anything what they want. Then China, United States can get lots of things. Chinese can get lots of things from the United States. But what can the United States get from China?
Well, China's one of the most rapidly... Yeah, his question is, it's pretty obvious what China can get from the United States, but what can we get from China? Let's go back a little bit in history. If you look in the 1990s, what happened if you got caught hacking in China? Well, they'd shoot you and they'd send your family a bill for the bullet. I mean, it was a pretty serious crime. But then, in April 1st, 2001, the US EP-3 collided with the Chinese J-8, which caused the loss of that Chinese aircraft. Anybody remember the name of that Chinese pilot, by the way? Kind of apocryphal name. Wang Wei. It was his name. And the guy was a hot dog. He was known to be a hot dog. He'd fly up to US aircraft, hold signs in the window. Well, then what I had heard about at the time was the Chinese government had said, hey, look what the United States is doing to us. They got these spy planes off our coast. You should go hack America. Well, the Chinese are going, are you nuts? You kill people for doing that. But American hackers heard about that and said, good idea, we'll hack back. And so that was kind of the hack back, and that sort of ushered in the new age. Now let's roll the clock forward a little bit. We have capabilities in China, which is now ostensibly the fastest growing major economy in the world. If you're a Chinese hacker or an American and you're looking for where you're going to find growth in terms of opportunity for getting stuff, maybe it's all going to go toward China now because of the economic success. Now, as many people are aware, China does have some real serious concerns. It is going to say, hey, you know, you used to kind of joke, hey, teach your kids to speak Chinese so they can talk to their bosses when they grow up. But if you look at the social problems they have, particularly with a huge, massive economic disparity between the coastal regions and you go out to the west, the massive emigration going to the cities saying, hey, we need jobs, and of course you got that male-female imbalance, massive damage ecologically, difficulty in finding fresh water. Yeah, PRC leadership has got a very, very difficult time ahead. So what could the United States do to China? Potentially try to disrupt their military command and control, disrupt economic development. If you could go ahead and put bad data into some of the information that they're stealing, they might build stuff that doesn't work. You know, that's more active warfare, but that may be some solutions. Is that kind of along the lines of what you were thinking? Okay. Yes, sir.
Two questions. One is, how is it a lot of the people that are making all of these rules are, no offense to anyone, slightly older than people who know a lot about technology. So a lot of the people that are making the rules don't really understand technology very well.
Yeah, you know.
That way, and also, how about proxy wars, as in companies in China that aren't directly affiliated with the military, and companies in America that are not directly affiliated with the military.
Yeah.
How would that relate to cyber warfare?
Got it. Well, the first set of questions, you got to follow on that. Okay.
Kind of like the Middle East reference to the UK as a cyber. He's not a hacker. He's just a yes man passing a test that you like.
Yeah, interesting. In the year 2000, I submitted a thesis to the Naval War College. I'll come back and repeat your question, everybody, in a moment. Talking about the United States should create a new military service for cyber that does not have height and weight requirements, doesn't care whether you smoke pot or not, doesn't care whether you're overweight or have tattoos, or if you just live on Code Red and pizza. The point is, you got skills, and are you loyal to the United States? If so, you're in. You know what the response was for the War College? That thesis is so preposterous, it's not even worth writing. I had to change my thesis subject from my master's thesis from the military war college was on manpower policy or something that was acceptable. But his question was, these old guys are making the policy, but they're not the people that get it. And that's one of the concerns I expressed last year. Because, you know, for me, kind of at the leading edge, okay, one of my first computers I built was an Altair 8800 back in 1975. And so I grew up, if you will, with computer and cyber as a native language. You had the Henry Kissinger, remember the guy was American for years, but he always talked with a big German accent. Or Arnold Schwarzenegger, how's he have the Austrian accent? Our senior leadership didn't grow up with this stuff. I was probably at the leading edge, but again, I got tripped up by manpower policy. They said, you're too old, you can't stay. So 6 months before cyber stands up, I get flicked off because of old age, and I'm thinking, what, I feel like Moses, you know, you're up here, you're fighting, after 40 years, you're wanting the promised land, there it is. It's like, you're not gonna cross the river. So, oh man, yeah, dude, I feel for you. But the danger is that we're still beholden to a lot of policies that suggest that, oh, in the military you have to meet height and weight requirements, can you do so many push-ups, run, and things like that. We're missing the point entirely. The other concern that I had from an organizational perspective is U.S. Cyber Command is set up as from intelligence agencies, cryptological agencies, and things like that. Those have always been mission support. And so intelligence support, when I was the director of the Joint Operations Center for U.S. Pacific Command, I had like about 50 desks out there and all the wall, the ceiling monitors, and the phone with the speed dial of the White House and SecDef. And, you know, it's pretty cool. I mean, you're that. But right to my right-hand side was a guy from the Intel, J2. But I'm 3. 3 is operations. And so the commander, when he ever had to fight a war, would call up the 3. Ops makes the warfare happen. Now in cyber, they don't call 3, they call 2. 2 is, you know, will give you the intelligence support, but you have not been trained to pull the trigger. And so as a result, the fusing of 2 and 3, which is kind of a misnomer because we're fusing what? 2 and 6. We're saying, oh, they make Intel and IT. Or, you know, no, that's the wrong mix. If we wait another 28 years or so, we'll be good. Because for the last 11 years or so, we've been going to the military academies and creating opportunities to identify the cadets and the midshipmen who have the greatest potential. But then we make their careers such that you have to keep going back out to sea, you have to go to these combat tours, and you can't stay in it. I'll get your second question in a minute. Yes, sir. Yeah, in fact, what we're finding is the defense contractors have a huge amount of the capability that we have. Part of the reason is the value of the knowledge. Because if in the DoD, you're going to have 3 basic categories of manpower. You're going to have uniformed trigger pullers that go out in battle and get shot at and shoot back. You'll have the long-term civilian workforce that may be there for a 30, 35-year or longer career. And then you got the contractors. And if you look at how you do the work breakdown structure among those, what you want to do is if somebody has to pull a trigger or have a high level of accountability, they ought to be in uniform. If somebody's going to be the repository of the long-term knowledge of that organization, they're going to be your civilian staff. But if you've got a skill set that is either very fleeting or has no long-term value, like Y2K and COBOL programmers, for a while they had their little heyday and then they went back to asking if you wanted fries with that. But you wouldn't train your military to do that because you hire the contractors, let them do it. If I take a young sailor or a young soldier or take some sergeant, send him off and let him become qualified and get all these initials after his name, at the end of his enlistment, he comes back and says, hey, you want to re-enlist for $32,000 a year? Or want to go work for some cybersecurity company for $132,000 bucks? I had one guy who was at CarolinaCon here last year. I don't see him this year. So because he said, sir, I just got out after 4 years in the Marine Corps. I could re-enlist for about 28 grand, or he was starting a job for $184,000, and it wasn't even the war zone. It was just over in Central Command. Well, come on, that's like a no-brainer. So, yeah, the thing is that your people are going to be your repository in the civilian side. Back to the original question of proxy wars. See, I told you to get back to it. It all comes together. The proxy war is such that what if we have somebody else fight our war for us? If we have civilians doing it, or if the Chinese are using their civilians, or the Russian business network and the like, it's blurring the distinction from warfare. And that was part of the reason this Tallinn Manual is important, because they're trying to at least lay down the ground rules. But we don't know who the combatants are anymore.
Would you say that even despite all the massive death and reproduction, that the lack of innovative skills is going to be a problem that comes on the companies?
The lack of innovative skill, I mean haunting China or haunting the United States, or either?
Well, I mean, China's lack of being able to innovate their own.
Well, China is capable. I wouldn't necessarily put that broad-based judgment on Chinese that say, oh, you can't innovate. I mean, we should say that about Japan, right? Okay, we invent stuff and then they mass produce it. However, if you look at the society, and one of the things that made the United States really, really work well was the fact that we provided an economic incentive for people to develop intellectual capital. Because if you came up with an idea, you patented, you trademarked it, or whatever, you could benefit from that. If you take that away for the benefit of the country, and if you look at Soviet Union, part of the reason that Soviet-style communism failed is that you never got any rewards for what you created. And so I would think as China, who looked north, watched Russia pop the clutch and stall out the engine trying to go from communism to capitalism, China said, you know what, I'm going to ease this thing out really slow. And right after the Iron Curtain going down, Tiananmen Square comes up, and they said, you know what, we got to smack them down, because otherwise we're going to lose it too. You're number two, he's number one.
So your whole action pretty much says for I mean, outside of that,
Outside of write your congressman, what can you do?
seriously.
Get into the system. Be able to try to influence it. Cyber Command is hiring a whole bunch of people. They don't just need technicians, they need leadership. Be able to demonstrate leadership in your businesses and your lines of work in your communities by making sure that your security is working really, really well. Help the management, the pointy-haired bosses out there, the older people, actually get the fact that we're in a cyber war pre-stage where you have to actually worry about these things. And my goal would be to be able to take people in this room, who here would like to be a CEO or a president of a real corporation someday? All right, that's only about 10%, but that's enough. Because we think differently in the hacker community. We'll look at problems that everybody else will think is conventional, and we're going to go like, hey, wait a minute, if you like reach over here and pull that out, you get something that was available. So if we can get to that level instead of just staying in the junior security analyst, senior security analyst, uber security analyst, then ultimately CISO, and then you hard stop. Because I remember talking to Lee Kushner, who runs Lee Kushner Associates. He's been doing that headhunting firm since the 1990s. He said, Lee, how many CISOs have you ever seen get promoted to CIO in all your years of doing business? He said none. It stops. So you got to get out of that career track, because otherwise we're going to be beholden to people issuing orders, but the orders are being issued in the wrong capacity. Think I got time for one more?
No more than 2 more questions.
Okay, you're one, then two.
I was going to ask about your thesis, but more pertinent to the comment about innovation. Is it true that the Chinese government, the red
People's Liberation Army, yes.
yeah, are they not about the Communist Party?
Okay, the Communist Party of People's Republic of China.
I've heard that all of those leaders and the senior members are scientists and engineers by training, versus in the U.S., all of our leaders
Our lawyers
are lawyers
and crooks.
by training.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know enough about it to answer that question. His statement, for those who couldn't hear it, was the senior leadership in the Communist Party and the People's Republic of China seem to be scientists and engineers, where the United States they're politicians or lawyers and things like that. I don't know enough about the background of the Chinese to answer that. I'm sorry.
So, two little bits. How much of this sort of the attacks that are going on are motivated by economic gain, i.e., taking intellectual
Right.
property? And could that be thwarted by revising into reality intellectual property laws? Since there's no such thing as intellectual property and there's no way to really protect it, what if instead of spending all this money and all these resources trying to protect something that doesn't even really exist, we instead divert those resources toward opening the sharing of those things so that they would devalue their, it would make them a less attractive.
And then you're back to the problem of, his question was, what if instead of worrying about espionage and economic gain for people stealing secrets, if we could sort of devalue that and make it so it's not worth anything to steal? Then you go back to the initial problem, how do you reward the innovators? Because then you're going to say, I don't care how much innovation you come up with, how brilliant you are, you're going to get the same. It's the open source argument, and some people are very happy to do open source, but other people say, hey, I need to get paid for my time and effort.
You could divert the money that you're wasting trying to failing to protect it and instead fund it.
Well, if I, instead of diverting my money from...
Like when we put a guy on the moon.
Yeah.
That was
Oh, by the way, we can't put a guy on the moon anymore the same way we did because nobody saved copies of the blueprints. Do you know that? Seriously? The lunar lander and things? So bottom line is that what are we facing? We're facing an era where there's no clean solutions. We've got to go ahead and explore that. We've got to influence our decision makers, both in political and corporate and international, our diplomats and the like. We've got a challenge ahead of ourselves. It's going to be evolving over the next few years. You're going to live in interesting times, which is an old Chinese comment and sort of a curse. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. We're done.